Hi, so feeling no pressure at all. Welcome. Thank you for having me. There's some phenomenal talents in this room and I'm very excited to get questions from you all, if possible. What I'm going to present today is sort of the paper that's come out of 2 years of work looking at the debates going on around how particularly mobile data should be used in development and humanitarian policy. And obviously the data for development field is absolutely massive. I'm not aiming to cover it all today. This particularly focuses on mobile data because that was really at the forefront from sort of 2010 to 2014 when I started this research. So first of all, you know the story already because you were probably here yesterday. In 2014, the UN called for a data revolution to take advantage of the new sources, types of particularly big data that were already around in the developing world that had not been around until basically the coming of mobile phones. They realized that there was huge potential. Anyone who's read Morten Jerven's work knows about the problem with resourcing adequate statistical work in the developing world. In fact, anywhere. There's talk about replacing censuses with sort of big data solutions all over the world right now. And even more so for countries which are poorly resourced in terms of their statistics. Robert Kirkpatrick said back in 2013 at the IGF, we see big data as a real public good. And this made me start to think about what would happen if big data really did behave like a public good. What would that mean? Then I looked, and there's obviously a lot of public goods claims being made for big data, for instance, in the field of medical science, of government statistics, of open data. And so this seems to be a growing field of discussion, shall we just say. To give you a little background on CDRs, call detail records, these are usually fairly massive data sets stemming from people's use of their mobile phones. It doesn't have to be smartphones, this is any kind of mobile phone. Partly the reason why this data is so powerful is that even sort of a $10 Nokia in Ghana will produce equivalent data to that sort of phone, to a smartphone here in terms of people's mobility, in terms of a lot of different behavioral things. At the moment, sort of 81% of people on the African continent have a mobile and only 25% use internet. So that gives you an idea of why mobile might be important if you want to look at things like population movement, urbanization dynamics, economic behavior. Equally in Asia, 94% have a mobile, 42% use the internet. So although people's internet use, which is potentially sort of richer information sociologically speaking about what people are interested in and what they're doing and what they're buying, what they're thinking, we're not really there yet with internet use globally. We are getting there very fast with mobile phone usership. So pretty early on, people had the idea that mobile phone data was going to be very useful as a supplement or later as a replacement for survey data in certain places around demography, inequality, socioeconomic trends of all kinds, and then particularly crisis response. In 2010, there was this effort after the Haiti earthquake to track people's movement out of Port-au-Prince, particularly because there was a cholera epidemic going on in Flowminder. An NGO did some amazing epidemiological work demonstrating that mobile phone records were very important, were potentially very important, very useful for tracking disease in emergency situations. And particularly in low resource environments, this is going to be key. There's also obviously work going on by Global Pulse about nowcasting economic shocks through airtime purchases. Orange Telecom sponsored an amazing competition in 2013 and again in 2015 called Data for Development, which did a limited release of the largest ever developing country data set released for research, first from Cote d'Ivoire and then later on from Senegal. And around 70 papers were published out of each challenge that covered things like human mobility, socioeconomic segregation, health, malaria transmission, and also brought up really interesting ideas about how to visualize data, how to work with CDRs. So these have been very productive challenges. Here's one product of the first challenge, of the 2013 challenge, which focused on Cote d'Ivoire. I think this involved 5 billion separate call records, call and SMS records from the customers in Orange's network in Cote d'Ivoire over the course of nearly a year. What Gutierrez et al. Did is they attempted to estimate socioeconomic segregation. As you can see, they did it through, and this actually comes from a report by Rohan, so I've got Rohan's little explanation of it here, but it came through airtime credit purchases and also communication patterns. So they brought together the calls that people were making, the SMSs they were sending, with the way that they were buying airtime. And you can see here, they say that, well, basically they got from this that there are places of greater economic activity, more intense economic activity, and places of less intense economic activity. They equate this with richer places and poorer places. Now, anyone who works in development is going to find this interesting for a start, because anyone who's been to or knows Cote d'Ivoire knows that here we have Abidjan, the little purple dot here. Here we have the crossing to Ghana. Here we have the crossing to Liberia. And up top there we have crossings to Mali and Burkina. And you can see cities and towns, little purple dots along the way. So it's a reasonable thing to think that, greater economic activity in these places where the heat shows higher. However, if we think about it, anyone who's traveled across borders in West Africa knows that these are not necessarily rich places. These are places of economic activity, but they're also places of great risk, vulnerability, marginalization. They're places where people smuggle. They're places where people get into conflicts, and they're also places where people load up on airtime before they cross the border because their cell phone plan doesn't work the other side of the border. So anyone who's traveling temporarily is going to be putting a lot of money on their cell phone so that they can operate in the other country and then come back again. So what we're actually seeing is a lot of border crossing and a lot of economic activity. However, anyone who's been to Abidjan knows that the people of Abidjan are not uniformly wealthy. So what does this map actually tell us? It tells us a lot about the movement of goods and communications. It doesn't tell us a lot about why they're moving, what they mean, or what their effects are. So from this we get mobility and we get economic movement. We don't get outcomes. We don't get insights into the sociological aspects of what's going on there. So this becomes the next question. What can we do to know more about that? So the fact that this can also be used for epidemiology, for all sorts of things, has led to claims that data might be used as a public good. However, the debate that I've been studying for the last 2 years merges two notions of public good. One is that data should be more available in order to help people promote public good, promote social good in the public sphere. One example of this would be the website patientslikeme.com. Has anyone heard of that? Where people get online and talk about an illness that they have, and in the aggregate, those conversations add up to what can be used for clinical analysis of those particular illnesses. So it's sort of crowdsourcing medical data, basically. It's free, it's easy, it's a very good idea. And then there's a second argument that data should actually be recognized and operate like a public good, because its potential power for good is such that international institutions in particular should have access to data on principle. And the debate that I've been studying around this particular claim revolves around CDRs in particular, because also CDRs in their raw form are some of the most sort of privacy invasive data sets available, other than our Google search records and things like that. And so there's a lot of ethical debate about what it means to share CDRs, particularly under conditions of great pressure and urgency. So what is an informational public good? Well, information economists such as Stiglitz and Varian have said that obviously it's got the characteristics of a classic public good. It's non-rivalrous, so no extra costs are incurred when others use it, and it's non-excludable. It's impossible to keep others from using it in the first place. Examples would be radio broadcasts, fire alarm signals, emergency signals of any kind. So except that, those same information economists point out that the value of data to the private sector and certain regimes like taxation, patents, may determine a functional version of excludability. So if data is very valuable to the private sector, it, by definition, cannot be fully a public good. And this language was already emerging from the World Bank back in 2013, where it was terming big data a transformative asset class. So there's these two sort of competing ideas of big data as a new transformative asset class versus big data as a potential public good. And there's sort of the World Bank versus the UN. But again, there's a lot of crossover between those discussions. There's an alternative proposition. A colleague of mine has said that data actually functions as a system resource, where it's an ecosystem composed of people, platforms, and profiles, where by its nature, axiomatically, ownership is distributed. And therefore, in an ecosystem like this, and we've got various bodies, including the World Economic Forum, leaning very heavily on the terminology of data as personal data as an ecosystem. If data is an ecosystem, this raises again a functional problem for it becoming a public good, because there are too many interests to be reconciled for it to flow freely. So one ethical problem with the idea of data as a public good is that it starts to imply the idea that people, particularly the subjects of development, may have a duty to be visible. We start to weigh the visibility of people against their ability to receive essential other goods such as food, water, sanitation, remedies for disease, help in emergency situations. Ken Kukier said back in January, not using data is the moral equivalent of burning books. So he's equating caution about data, which is what he's referring to. He's referring to the non-release of CDRs during the Ebola crisis as censorship, effectively. To which one can also respond, what about the freedom to be invisible? If we start thinking about, rather than legal conceptualizations of privacy, if we start thinking about privacy as freedom, as a capability, maybe as social justice, as human dignity, how could we conceptualize the freedom not to engage with the data set, not to be in the database, not to have one's data used? Carly Nice said a while ago that it would be impossible for any European enterprise to collect location data on minorities, to require SMS reporting about drug adherence, or to establish large databases of sensitive information without safeguards. Yet, she went on to say, this is what D4D seems to be intent on doing. So what is going on here? There is a very, very strong argument for making data more available. We all know it. It came up most strongly during the Ebola epidemic, 2014 to 2015. There was massive global publicity and horror about what was happening in West Africa, and rightly so, and massive media pressure to contain the disease through any method possible. And a lot of the tech media in particular lit upon CDRs as the way to do this. And this was interesting because it has been debated and analyzed a lot. And I think we're arriving at a conclusion that there's a lot of difficulties with using CDR data for a disease like Ebola. Particularly, this is the economist down here, Ken Kukier again, saying that mobile phone records would help combat the Ebola epidemic, but getting to look at them has proved hard, and positing privacy laws and norms as being highly problematic for saving lives. So then we get an alternative point of view from Linus Bengtsson, who runs Flowminder, which is the NGO that dealt with the Haiti earthquake data, the CDRs, back in 2010. He's been working on epidemiology using CDRs since 2010. And in 2015, he says, if you're planning traffic, you need the whole picture to model the road. If you're trying to catch an individual traffic offender, the model of traffic can help, but it's really an entirely different ballgame. So he uses this to explain why CDRs are only helpful in a limited way with a problem like Ebola. With Ebola, you need to see the other person, which you don't see in the mobile data. You don't see who the call is being made to. You don't see the behavior and the movement of the other person. They may be on another network. They may not be in the data set you're looking at. So it's not as interesting for Ebola as for vector-borne diseases. A vector-borne disease is something like malaria. A vector is the mosquito. It's whatever is carrying the disease. Just because you go to the same 100-kilometer square area doesn't mean you met someone. And he makes a very good point. So with Ebola, we run into the problem of big data versus helpful data. Sean McDonald and Amy Wissolowski, who've taken respectively a legal perspective, a legal human rights perspective, and an epidemiologist's perspective on this problem, have said that basically to really use CDRs to combat Ebola, they would need to be raw, because you need to see actual contact between people. You need to see actual movement to the same place at the same time. You need to see how long people stayed in the same place. You also need cross-border mobility data, which anyone who's tried to study mobility in West Africa knows, unfortunately, does not exist or is very, very dodgy where it does exist, because there's a ton of open land borders and people just cross. And you need household surveys that include religious and ethnic data. You need to know how people treat their dead. Unfortunately, you need to know what they're doing with dead bodies, to know whether they're transmitting Ebola or not. You need to know whether they're having sex, whether they're kissing, whether they're hugging their family members. You need to know all about human behavior. You don't just need to know if they're in the same space. So what we have here is two maps. We have a map, Amy Wesolowski's map of connectivity in West Africa. These black dots are previous Ebola epidemics. As you can see, they predominantly occur in or around more forested areas, not around the areas of high human connectivity. This outbreak happened in here, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, an area of very, very high human connectivity, very high cross-border connectivity. What you can see here is the ECOWAS bloc, which basically has freedom of movement and freedom of trade. So you need a lot of cross-border data to understand flows of Ebola. What you have here is the Telenor project where they collaborated with Harvard Public Health to look at dengue in Pakistan. This was in 2015. And they basically looked at a vector-borne disease, it's borne by mosquitoes, and it's dependent on how many people move between Lahore and Karachi during sort of July, August, September every year. And in September you get an outbreak. And there's no cure for dengue. All you need is public health resources to treat the disease. So the Pakistani government wanted to know how many treatment centers do we need to put in Lahore in September each year. And so they did a pilot study to look at how you would do that. This is a very effective map for an information problem. Okay? It tells you how many people are going to be arriving in Lahore and developing dengue in September. This causes a huge problem because you need to bring together like 17 different types of highly intimate raw data to predict whether people are actually getting together and transmitting Ebola or not. So what we have is dengue as an informational problem versus Ebola as basically a structural problem. It's not just an informational problem. There's a reason Ebola did not become an epidemic when it arrived in America, when it arrived in Britain, Spain, the Netherlands. It's because public health systems there are better funded, better organized, better resourced. It's not easy combating Ebola in ECOWAS countries. It's much easier combating it in Texas or in London or in Scotland. And so we have a structural problem here that we're trying to address with claims on big data's availability. So this is another problem. We may have an insoluble problem going on. So out of this problem grew the responsible data dialogues, one might term them. This was composed of meetings, conferences, discussions, projects, an email list, a lot of activists discussing with sort of engineers, computer scientists. They were super interesting. They happened basically 2014 to 2016. They've been convened by Global Pulse, by the World Economic Forum, by the Light and Peace Innovation Lab, by the Data Pop Alliance, and by a number of other institutions, but these are the main ones. And their purpose was to seek ethical frameworks and guidelines within which to share data, and basically to formalize those guidelines. This became the sticking point. They were very interdisciplinary, and the conveners, interestingly, were also potential intermediaries if the talks succeeded in putting together frameworks and guidelines that worked. The ideal was that we'll come out of these with a piece of paper that says how you can safely share CDRs anywhere in the world, and then X institution and Y institution can become intermediaries through which that data will flow to NGOs and analysts that need it. So this was the aim. This is my map of what happened next. Here, I don't know if you can all see it, there's some hubs, we're terming them, which have high out degree, so they have a lot of outgoing connections. They're convening a lot of other parties, okay? This is the network of the debate. World Economic Forum, Global Pulse, Data Pop, the Engine Room, and Leiden there in the middle are all hubs that convene around trying to produce this standardized framework. Then you get authorities who are the ones who are convened, who are the experts and the data holders. And they sort of inhabit the central portion of the diagram. There's a huge range of people and institutions in there. And then you get institutions that were just kind of consulted. And you can see that each different sort of community of consultation includes a lot of institutions that didn't connect with the other institutions that were either holding the data or actually knew about the sort of social scientific or computer scientific implications of using that data. So you've got a bunch of experts in the middle, and a bunch of interesting sort of almost isolates on the edges. And what this told me, and what I know from observing these discussions, was that this sort of multipolarity speaks to the need to capture the standardization process. So you had a lot of institutions that were very interested in owning the standardized guidelines. As well, you get sort of low modularity, at least in the middle, that everybody's pulling at these authorities, pulling them in different directions to try and capture the truth about how to standardize the guidelines, with this sense that somebody knows if we can just convene the right group of people, we'll get the guidelines out of this in one weekend. You know, and so there's a lot of toing and froing about power here. And the hubs as well that are convening, the ones around the edges, the reason that I think that they have all of these extra people they're convening that are not being that helpful, these are sort of often legal experts and consultancies, is because they want to increase their power. They want to increase the amount of consultations they're having as a way to show that they're the most authoritative in the debate. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work because what's come out of this is some really interesting discussions, which I'm about to go over, but not actually some stable guidelines. So why has an agreement not been reached? Why do we not have that piece of paper? Well, one reason is that there is a real conflict between a sort of data mining and engineering logic and the data ethics logic that's emerged from these discussions. And this is an interesting and I think productive thing in itself. that we've achieved some sort of multidisciplinary conversation which points out that these disciplines are really going in different directions with regard to how to use data. I've sort of reproduced here a flowchart that was presented at a UN Global Pulse convened meeting last year in Leiden, where the privacy officer of Global Pulse presented the idea that they had, which is that you identify the potential risks and harms of a particular intervention, for instance, using a data set to combat Ebola, and their potential likelihood of occurring. Then you identify a potential beneficiary, and then you identify and quantify the intervention's positive effects and weigh them against the harms identified. Can anyone see a logical problem with this diagram? You identify the risks and harms, then you say exactly what you're going to do, then you identify the benefits. In this system, the benefits will always outweigh the harms. The answer will always be, yes, you should do this. Because the only contextualized information is about the benefits. The risks and harms are supposed to be generic, right? So this is problematic. And then you get social scientists coming in and saying, actually, what we need is collaboration between computer scientists, data scientists, and social scientists who know the location in question, and people from the location in question. So we need participatory involvement as well, obviously, you know, and nobody's disagreeing with this at any point. It's just that we're sort of struggling between these two different viewpoints. You know, and also that it has to be iterative. There is no single A4 sheet of paper that will solve this problem. It's going to change according to the application of the data set itself, the population in question, and the problem. So then you get the mobile operator's perspective. So then I went and did some field work with Orange and with Telenor to talk to them about their experience of trying to share data or actually sharing data. And they really described data as behaving like a system resource. They described that there was no single decision-making point, and it really acted like an ecosystem. You've got here a country subsidiary, the ones that actually gather and handle the data in the first place, and that keep it. You've got the CSR department, which is usually in a completely different country on a different continent, which is concerned with branding, basically, and with the ethics of the issue, but how the ethics impact on branding primarily. You get a privacy officer, again at headquarters, very, very far away from the problem in question, who's dealing with the legal implications of sharing the data. You get research partners. In the case of Telenor, this was Harvard. In the case of Orange, this was, I think, 216 different parties that received its data set, who are all interested in a research outcome that they can publish that is interesting and helpful in the field. And then you get the research unit within the telco itself, which is interested for various reasons in research quality. They're judged by their company on the quality of the research and collaborations that they produce. Also, they actually want to help people. So there's definitely, all of these parties have some altruism involved, but their other motives, which they actually get paid for, are conflicting usually. So we have this sort of round and round action where it's very hard to get data out of the subsidiary, and it's very hard to determine exactly how that data should be used to keep it legal and safe. One interesting solution that's come out of this, Orange developed Opal, the open algorithm, which I think probably Emmanuel is going to talk about later, which is a way to bring the code to the data, basically, to bring the problem to the data rather than bringing the data to the problem. So various interesting technological solutions have been coming out of this. So what do we get from this? Well, the search for standardization is in many ways a consequentialist endeavor. Consequentialism, one way of interpreting consequentialism is a utilitarian calculation where you say, how many people can I save with this data set? How many people's privacy may be harmed by this data set? Should I share the data set or not? This became problematic because, as Robert Kirkpatrick shows with this quote here, you wind up trying to balance privacy against access to essential goods and human safety. He says, privacy is your right. So is access to food, water, humanitarian response. The challenge is that we see a lot of regulatory frameworks which don't have the right litmus test. And in many ways, the search for standardization is the search for a single litmus test that will tell you that it's okay to share this data set because it will save lives. The problem is formalizing the benefits and the costs. Because one thing about the costs is we don't know what they are, and they may be distributed over a very long period of time. The costs may be incurred when the next government comes in, or when there's a coup and the data is misused by the following government. It may be incurred when a currently non-existent adversary gets hold of the data set and in retrospect is able to draw things from it that are harmful for the people involved. We simply cannot know the implications of letting data flow freely in the field. And again, nobody is actually arguing you should release raw data sets. Nobody is saying this. But the implications of CDRs are such, even in de-identified form, that we do need to think very carefully about what will happen in the future if we release them. Meanwhile, the incentives to keep data scarce are actually very high. And what I think is that the public good claim is actually a way of highlighting data scarcity. Perversely, the more we circulate a conversation about how data must be a public good, how important it is, how dangerous it is that data is not flowing freely, that only highlights the fact that data is a scarce good, a very valuable good, and this benefits certain parties immensely. The public good claims that highlight data scarcity actually offer status to mobile operators because they gain the status as gatekeepers of the data. The hubs in the previous diagram of the debate network, they gain from convening others. And we saw that the weight of status gained by those hubs in that diagram is huge. There's sort of hundreds of different organizations coming together to discuss, with those hubs essentially acting as authorities. And the authorities in the center of that diagram also gain from being convened. There are millions and millions of dollars and euros and pounds flowing around the search for these guidelines. There is national pride flowing around. The Netherlands wanted a seat on the Security Council for 2018. And the search for these guidelines became one focal point for its argument that it should be a humanitarian leader in the global sphere. The government of The Hague, similarly, The Hague wants to be the city of peace and justice, and as part of its branding, it gave several million to Leiden University to convene these discussions. So there's a lot of benefits that accrue to being a convener, but not a huge amount of benefits once the data actually does start to flow. If you found the magical formula, the golden ticket, I think maybe the incentives would change significantly. So what do we have? We already had, before this discussion, Orange had figured out how to do a limited release of a transformed data set. This was how it did the D4D competitions in 2013 and 2015. In Telenor's dengue study, they did a remote access model. I'm getting this terminology from Yves de Montjoie, who's written all of this stuff up as part of a group with several people in the room today. Remote access, where researchers get a version of the data aggregated into matrices. There are other options as well, like a Q&A model, where specific questions can be posed through an API without actual access to the raw data at any point. Opal is a development on from this. Opal is not this. But Opal is sort of based on this logic, as I understand it. You're going to tell me I'm wrong in a minute. And then you get a version with pre-computed indicators and synthetic data, which FlowMinder actually did use in the Ebola epidemic. It parameterized its model for the movement of the disease using CDRs, but it didn't actually release any of the data. So what did we get from this debate, which has not produced standardized guidelines and frameworks? Well, it produced some very interesting lessons, I think. One is that the sort of utilitarian consequentialist approach is insufficient to the question being asked. This in itself is useful because it's really all that the field has come up with so far. Another thing we've got is that ethics questions require institutional solutions. All of the technological solutions coming out of this debate also require an ethics board at some point. They require humans to get in the way of the project and to try and figure out what its potential impacts may be. I haven't seen any solution or any proposition in this entire debate which doesn't involve at some point social science getting in the way of data sharing. The issue of collective privacy is interesting. It has emerged in about 5 different geographic and conversational spaces. It's a sort of meta-legal notion. It goes against current law, which is based on the idea of privacy as property, privacy as individual identifiability. And it deals with issues of what does it mean for the village rather than the individual. If I can identify, thank you, if I can identify that data says that these people are more likely to get Ebola than these people, what does it mean for the group? It doesn't mean I've identified any people by name. It doesn't mean I've chased anyone down and put them in quarantine. It just means that this village may get a protective cordon of people with machine guns around it. And that's not covered by any current conceptualization of informational privacy that we really have, which is interesting. A redefinition of what is safe data. The work of the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative has shown that satellite data that shows no humans at all is actually very risky for the people on the ground, because in their case they're looking at South Sudan, and they're looking at attacks by the Sudanese government forces on people in South Sudan on a village level, and their data shows which villages have not yet been destroyed. And so in effect, when that data is hacked, it becomes a guideline on how to massacre the next group of people. But the data is officially safe because there are no humans in it at all. So we have issues which go beyond current laws and conceptualizations of privacy, and which are highly problematic, which are coming out all over the place in these debates, which are very, very useful, and which do help us to think about where to take that consequentialist question: what are the costs? Finally, the contestation itself about information problems versus structural problems is something that I think has characterized development studies since its beginnings, and is a very, very important debate to be having. And I think there's starting to be a recognition that this debate happens with every new era of development, and the big data era is no different, but that we need to take lessons from previous debates about what are information problems or financial problems, and what are human development problems that are much broader and more complicated and structural, into this new era of big data. Also, there are pretty amazing technical solutions being developed that do address a large part of this problem and address the technical portion of the problem really, really well. And that's exciting too. So bringing those together with the debate about the ethics is going to be an interesting proposition when they're in the field. So emerging issues, last slide. What are the trade-offs of what you might term wholesale, very, very large-scale research via satellite, via CDRs, remote research on developing country populations, versus what you might term retail development research, participatory research that happens on the ground, talking to people and getting people to describe their own environment? What are the trade-offs between those two? And this, again, this is a very long-standing discussion. It's been going on since at least the 1970s, I think. But the big data era brings it into even sharper relief, I think, because you can really remotely analyze everybody on the planet now using CDRs, using satellite data, using all sorts of things. To what extent can the technical solutions emerging address problems of privacy and freedom? This seems like a no-brainer. Of course they can't. Why should they? It's not their job. But they make people discuss privacy and freedom in new ways. And I think that is useful, and I think we need fora for that to happen in, which don't currently exist. What should be the relationship of development and humanitarian research to the global data market? All of this data is part of the global data market, as well as having a development or humanitarian function. So what does that mean for the future of the data? How do you think longitudinally about the data that you're using in an ethical way? Because eventually it flows into the larger data market. And so do the conclusions of development and humanitarian research. How are those going to impact those populations in future? And finally, legibility and visibility. This is something I've written about elsewhere, and it's a larger conversation, but there's an idea that populations become legible to the state through the gathering of statistics. And that is, and this was described by James Scott in 1998 in the book Seeing Like a State, which has been very influential. States see people through their data, and they act on them through their data. Scott didn't see this as entirely unproblematic, but there's also a mutuality, a reciprocity to legibility, where at least in theory you can have democratic representation occurring through that. You can have the state understanding what the population needs and what is missing and helping people. With datafied visibilities, we miss that reciprocal element. Visibility simply awards information about people to a much smaller conglomeration of people at a tech hub somewhere in the world. So you can see from an office in New York or Amsterdam or Paris far more, probably, than a developing country state may be able to see. This is problematic for the development of democracy, for citizenship, for representation. It's problematic in a whole variety of ways. And we need to think about what that means. What does it imply a duty of visibility, and if so, to whom? And what is the responsibility of the one who is visualizing that population? Must data be shared back to local governments? Must data be shared back to local authorities? This debate is not really happening adequately yet. If we don't address it, we might wind up in the situation described by Simon Reed Henry when he wrote that the global borderlands may become an appropriate site for the experimentation in the governments of people. Thank you very much. If anyone wants the references, there they are.
Thanks very much, Linnet. We have about 15 minutes for questions, so maybe should we take 2 or 3 at a time?
Sure.
And address them that way? So If you'd like to, one here, one there, and one there. So if you'd like to go first.
So, Linnet, fabulous, thank you.
Thank you.
As you know, I've been involved in some of those things. I just wondered whether your research, particularly in Africa and in parts of Asia, there's a real momentum to introduce mandatory SIM registration. That means nobody can have a mobile phone. Sorry, my throat isn't what it should be. So, in various parts of the world, increasingly, nobody can obtain a mobile phone unless they register their identities, and increasingly, their biometric identity. So, and then part of the UN SDGs is that everybody shall have a legal identity, and there are birth registration programs using mobile. So I'm just wondering, in relation to this, it's going to be harder for someone to remain invisible, and there are all sorts of consequences and issues in relation to the use of this data, if you like. So I'm just wondering if that's formed part of your research.
My question is around the definition of ethics. If we take the normative definition of ethics, would it change this? By this I mean utilitarian theory.
So, first of all, the OPAL technical stuff was developed at MIT, not by Orange. Okay. And Eve was the sort of lead to that.
I know.
The thing that comes to me is that most problematic stuff happens when you're talking about individual data, and that society has reached some sort of accommodation, not perfect, when it comes to what I'll call sort of census map data. So these are things that are aggregated and put on a map and made public. So they're open data that are a description of society. And so one thing that seems much less problematic, although your village example is a place where it is problematic, is to be able to put things into this census-like format. And part of that is that there's an education of people understand maps, so that there's a literacy about that. And part of it is that it does not include individual data, which limits its use, but surprisingly little. And that we have a lot of government structures for privacy, for protection around that type of format. And I wonder if you would comment about what you think about that as a place to begin.
Thank you. Okay, going in reverse order. Yes, I think some of the most interesting sort of democratizations of data that we're seeing right now are definitely around participatory mapping, sort of MapTibera type stuff. And there's definitely a need to to reduce the inequalities in mapping between high income and low income countries, to increase map literacy everywhere, because it's really politically important. You're completely right. And we see a lot of efforts to do that. Of course, there are a lot of good things that come out of opening data. I'm not against open data in any way. And I think that open census data, to the extent that it can be open, is a really important resource, and I've used it. I use the DHS, I use census data wherever I can. Where would we be without these data sets, right? And they're created for a reason. They're created because they enable a large cast of people to endeavor to do social good with their research. Right? And I think everyone in this room is probably part of that or connected to that in some way. So I'm preaching to the choir. However, I think there are emerging issues. I think it's the issues we don't know about that are interesting here. One is cadastral mapping. I think that, for instance, the OpenStreetMap's humanitarian division's work in Haiti with the World Bank on cadastral mapping is interesting, because it starts getting into the territory of who actually owns the land. How does that relate to who uses the land? How does that relate to who sells the land? And for these things to be collated under the authority of a single body that happens to have the satellite photos or have the map is problematic. So I guess one question is, how do we bring together the participatory mapping with the potential power asymmetries inherent in sort of top-down mapping? So that's one question that comes out of your point. Another is around health. I think we saw some very troubling kinds of quarantining activity in ECOWAS countries during the Ebola epidemic. And I think that epidemiological mapping and mobility tracking through CDRs particularly has the potential to contribute to that under the wrong circumstances. Unfortunately, we are rich in the wrong circumstances globally. I think it would be fantastic if we could come up with some way to make that safer. But I think ultimately we do reach, in the end, we always run into this wall of who is going to determine in this particular context what this data can do. That's my problem. And it's as true for census data, of course, as it is for CDRs or for any other kind of data. But big data brings this up in particularly important ways because it is so unregulated right now. I know that it's really hard to get hold of, ironically. But also the data market is pretty unregulated. And so a lot of the stuff can happen, you know, the data for development discussions are unusual in that they feel very regulated, they're constrained by laws and norms and rules, whereas the global data market is really just a global free flow of data right now. So we sort of need to think about how those things are going to interact over time. So yeah, land ownership, health, and the violence aspect that I brought up that Nathaniel Raymond is talking about everywhere is really important as well, I think. When we're talking about humanitarian data, the kind of work that OCHA wants to do, opening data within the UN system, you know, Nathaniel has an example of you talk about refugee camps from two different open data perspectives, and bringing those two perspectives together on the data enables you to figure out who is where and potentially to recapture child soldiers. You know, you've heard him say that, I think. So these are, of course, isolated incidents, and yes, they happen at the individual level, but it's important not to confuse that with individual personal data, I think. The impact may be on the individual level, but the datafication and the analysis is happening often on the collective and de-identified level, and that to me is really interesting. That is some new problems that we're coming up with. Anyway, sorry, but this is a larger conversation. Normative approach to ethics, yes. We can see lots of different approaches to ethics, I think, clashing in this discussion, and I think you correctly identify that, so that's the right question to be asking. I try to stay away from that, first of all, because I'm not an ethicist, embarrassingly. I observe how people are perceiving ethics in this context, and I try to clarify how those things are in conflict and contestation with each other. And we do see the utilitarian perspective in conflict with, I think, a deontologist perspective. But I think in that diagram that I showed of the different conflicting ecosystemic ideas in the cell phone company, in the telco, you can see sort of deontological perspectives where the research group and the research collaborators are pretty much altruistic, you know, versus the people that want to brand, the people that want to protect, the people that want to keep the data legal and safe and political. And I think you have all of these different ethical perspectives also circulating inside that ecosystem. So that's something to look at in future. And finally, Pat's question about SIM registration and the SG right to identity. This is really interesting. This is something we should talk more about. Yes, data does different jobs and identity does different jobs. That's a no-brainer, right? Depending on the circumstances, again. So I think this comes back to my problem with the legibility, visibility thing. We want identity for legibility issues. We want people to be legible to their state and to authorities and to some extent to each other. You know, it's an essential part of data being able to build community and facilitating community interaction and political interaction, and also questioning the authorities, and identity is part of that. Anonymity is also an essential part of that. Activism runs on anonymity a lot of the time, you know, good as well as bad. You know, so yes, this is a big debate. I don't think we can resolve it here, but yes, we need to look at the different jobs that data does. And they're controlled by, the authorities are always going to want greater identifiability. So this feeds into the larger discussion about should activists be allowed to be anonymous, I think. And ultimately for me, should individuals be allowed to be anonymous? I think the freedom to be anonymous is being lost and is important, and we need to debate how we can get it back, but that's personal.
We have one more question over here. Are there any others? Dorothea, anyone else? Okay, if you could start, there's a microphone over there. Could you hand it down?
My question is, what are we comparing against? I think the comparisons are very emotive, but they are unfair. I think we are in Europe, where people have been quarantined, entire villages have been razed because of infectious diseases. based on bad information during the plague. Now, in the case of big data, you're saying we might identify a village, a collective harm could befall that village because there'll be people with machine guns around it. What would you prefer? That it's based on big data or that it's based on hearsay and rumor? Because that is the real comparison. The villages are going to be surrounded with people with machine guns. The villages are going to be razed to the ground based on bad information. So if you're in this intermediate space where big data is there and it's not perfect, but my question is, why position it against some kind of abstraction rather than the reality on the ground? And that's the same issue that I have with your idea of reciprocity. With reciprocity, you're saying with big data, you have this sort of remote entity where the community that is being observed has no in play, has no input. But isn't that the case with census data? The classic instrument by which government was observing its subjects. There was no reciprocity. They counted, they analyzed, and they took decisions based on that. But why is that not being compared? That's the reality of today's, how the state sees its subjects. Why not compare that with big data rather than with some abstraction?
Thank you very much for a really thoughtful keynote. I'm trying to learn lessons here for a different kind of ethics process that we're kicking off over in ICT for D and kind of in sort of conference environments. And when you showed the picture of the different stakeholders there, some of it looked depressingly familiar in terms of the highly competitive nature and the branding wars of whether it's NGOs, whether it's universities, whether it's UN agencies, whether it's companies. And I wonder if you had any sort of top tips for, apart from just saying it's depressingly familiar and they're all at each other's throats when it comes to competition, in terms of how do you facilitate in a highly, the universities are operating in a highly neoliberalized environment. They're all competing against each other. How can we turn some of this around to actually construct something like a public good and a public good discourse in an environment where higher education is not necessarily seen as a public good anymore? So we're kind of pushing against a trend here, and I think I'm just looking for some ideas where we can get universities, NGOs, UN partners and so on to maybe think differently about their work, just for a moment suspend the competitiveness and just try to do something bigger than their individual institutions.
Well, I kind of want to crawl under the table and hide now. You're so right. You're so right. Again, I'm going to go backwards from you to Rohan. Branding wars, that's a great way of describing what's in that diagram. I was trying to be nice, but that's really what I saw. Yes. Is anyone in this room on the responsible data email list? I know you are. I see your faces. Yeah? Nobody else? Richard, you're not? Okay, I thought you were. Okay. Okay, there's a responsible data email list that is the invisible counterpart to that network diagram, which is potentially, I think, is going to create much greater understanding, much better debate. A lot of the people that are producing really thoughtful work are on the list, but not in those discussions. That doesn't mean to say the people in the discussions are not thoughtful, but it's a different type of debate. It allows more space for activists. There's a lot of invisible people on the list who just read. And a lot of, debates happen there that continue over months, and people find them and add into them, and there are some fascinating threads on there. I really recommend it. It's a different model. Of course, it doesn't help at all with the convening question, but there are better spaces, and maybe trying to connect those spaces in some way, trying to find the debates that are really pushing through in those spaces, and bring them into the room would be an interesting way to go. There was a really interesting one about Ebola, for instance. There have been a bunch about privacy in developing country environments. I think that even though it's difficult, keeping the discussion multidisciplinary has been really important because it brings out these contestations. And that has ultimately been constructive because ultimately people do see they're not getting anywhere. You know, all of these incentives are actually helpful, in fact, because they push people towards the knowledge that they must be convening in the wrong way. You know, so maybe this is a learning process that we're in, and maybe all of these learning processes replicate earlier learning process about the development of statistics, about the development of probabilistic reasoning, about population science, about social science itself. Maybe we're just in at the birth of a new field and it's uncomfortable, it's meant to be like this, I don't know. But you're right, it's highly financially incentivized, and that's difficult, and it's incentivized by status. I think keeping the goals a little smaller as well. The most frustrating meetings that I've been at have been those ones where you get the lawyers and the technical people and the social scientists sent into breakout groups to resolve a particular problem and to come back with a paragraph that resolves how you share X data for X purpose. And all that we do is discuss how it's impossible, and then we come back with really interesting insights into how impossible it is, which is very frustrating for the convener, you know. And so keeping the goals lighter and smaller might seem to be one way to go. But I wish I knew. And if you come up with it, please tell me. Rohan, yes, I think we actually agree. I was thinking, absolutely, is it called Evesham, the village, where they just shut people in with the plague? What was it called? Thank you. Yeah, Eyam, yeah. Where they just shut people in. It's a very famous story, and that was absolutely in my mind when I saw West Point, those images of West Point in the news with the people with the machine guns and the barbed wire in Monrovia. This is exactly the problem. Big data can't get us beyond the encircling people with machine guns unless we use what Sean McDonald talks about in his paper, which is raw CDRs combined with raw census data, all sorts of stuff combined with actual on-the-ground studies. One slide that's missing from this is that there's an organization called Geopoll, which did individual SMS-based polling with people that asked them, that was actually working for the World Food Programme, was asking them about food insecurity during the Ebola epidemic. And they came up with some interesting information because they weren't asking people about Ebola. They asked people about checkpoints. People said, since Ebola has reappeared in Sierra Leone in 2015, there are a lot more checkpoints. We're afraid of people at the checkpoints, so we're going around the checkpoints. These were public health resources being spent at these checkpoints. People were afraid because there were guards with guns. So the guards with guns solution is not useful. But micro-level data shows us that people are going around X checkpoint. That is helpful, right? But it's not big data, it's SMS, it's individual SMS messaging. Also, people are avoiding public health centers because they can't get care for other stuff than Ebola. So people who may also be getting Ebola are not arriving in the public health system because they feel like they'll be quarantined. So understanding sociologically sort of undercurrent, well, not undercurrents, the circulation of information, the circulation of rumor, the circulation of fear is super important and doesn't have to, CDRs are completely irrelevant to that discussion, I think. So I think it's more this plus this rather than this or this. But yes, you're right, big data replicates the problem of encircling a settlement with soldiers, basically. And the reciprocity, let me look back on what you said. Is there a difference between that? I think that's a very negative view. James Scott would agree with you. He brings up very good instances where census data has been used to control, where the biopolitical power is not used well. You're right, I'm talking about an ideal, but I think it's the best we have. It's the Rousseau-insertion contract, where we give up something in return for having a government. We give up some of our freedom, including some of our data, in return for having a government that knows who we are, with the expectation that we can control the government so it does good things with that data. You're right, most of the time that's either irrelevant or actively not happening. But there is a greater possibility with census data flowing to a government than there is with big data flowing to a multinational corporation, I think. Why is that multinational corporation incentivized to do anything for the population of users other than provide them with better deals on their cell phones? I think there's a massive misalignment of incentives and objectives there that is pretty obvious. I don't think you can equate it. Big data, I'm defining big data as proprietary data mainly here. Censuses are big data too, if you treat them the right way. I mean, it's mainly about the technical methodologies, right? but I think that census data is collected under a social contract that offers the potential, the idealized potential for reciprocity, should we just say. And big data is absolutely not. When you walk down the street emitting your GPS data from your cell phone, you don't expect to be served by your government based on that data. I don't. Really, all my e-commerce records online. I don't expect that to feed into how I'm taxed, how I'm treated by my government. So I think there is an important difference there. But yeah, I wish governments were nicer too.
On that note, we're sadly out of time, but thanks for this thoughtful way of kicking off.